G'day, Chris here and welcome back to ClickSpring. Ian and Drew have requested a bit more detail on the furnace that I've built and tested over the last few months. Now to some extent it's the typical furnace that you've probably seen before, built around the Ron Reel burner design. But there are a few differences that might interest you that I'll point out along the way. Starting with the regulator, for the prototype version of the furnace I used a cheap no-gauge regulator and I immediately upgraded it to this one. It does add a lot to the cost of the furnace, but I think the gauge is definitely worth having because other than sound, it's all you've really got to indicate the energy input rate to the furnace. The regulated gas flow travels down to the burner, which consists of a brass pipe with a hole in it surrounded by a bell reducer plumbing fitting. As the gas exits the hole, it draws in a flow of air from outside the bell reducer. This airflow mixes with the gas, travels down the tube to the flame front and then ignites. It's an incredibly successful and widely used design, and for a home shop furnace or a forge, it's very hard to beat. Here are the components that I've used to make it, and you'll also find them listed in the text below this video. The gas burner jet is simply a brass pipe nipple drilled with a 1.1mm hole. The hole size controls the rate of gas flow, and I found this to be about the right size for this furnace. The bell reducer is then drilled out to accept the brass pipe nipple. The brass components are assembled threaded through the hole, and a spot of JB Weld epoxy holds them in place with an airtight seal. And I've taken care to make sure that the jet aims straight down the middle of the steel pipe nipple, using the drill bit as a reference. The epoxy needs a good 12 hours to cure, and then once fully hard, the drill bit can be removed and the other parts of the burner assembled. Now it's worth pointing out that at this stage the burner can't sustain a flame at the end of the burner tube without a tuyere to slow down the gas flow. Usually you'd see this as a flared tube at the end of the burner, but in this design the tuyere is integral with the base of the furnace, and the burner connects to it using one of these couplings, but more on that in a moment. For the base, I had a sheet metal fabricator make a few of these hoops from mild steel sheet. This contains the refractory as it's poured, and the dimensions are listed below. The moulds for the cavity and plinth were made by using the cut-off ends of these plastic buckets. I used hot glue to hold them together and a short section of PVC pipe for the entry hole. There does need to be a hole in the metal hoop to allow the coupling to sit in place, but I think you get the general idea. And a good coating of silicone spray helps the mould separate from the refractory once it's cured. A set of screws at regular intervals ensures that the steel perimeter is retained on the cast base. And here's a closer look at the castable refractory. This particular castable contains quite a high amount of silica, and it's rated up to 1400 degrees Celsius. And finally, here's a closer look at the finished item that I've been using for the last few months, showing everything in place. Now the key to the built-in tuyere is a small lump of mortar in front of the opening and a slight flare at the mouth of that opening, both of which are easy to form using a bit of high temperature mortar once the base casting has set. At low gas flow rates, the slight flare to the opening is enough to keep the flame attached. But as the gas flow rate increases, the flame detaches and moves forward to a point just beyond the lump of mortar. Now, I'm not entirely sure about the fluid mechanics at work here, but it appears to be acting as a sort of partial tuyere in the channel of the base. Whatever the actual physics, the main thing is that it works. These two features ensure that the flame is very well controlled at all gas flow rates, and it's a very simple approach that neatly solves a number of issues. First, there's no need to forge a metal tuyere, so that's an immediate time saving. Second, the entry, support and positioning of the burner are all taken care of by the threaded coupling being cast directly into the refractory. And finally, there's no hole for unwanted air to be drawn into the furnace, as would be the case if the burner was sitting free in an entry cavity. The body of the furnace simply rests on top of the base and has an outer shell of sheet metal construction. Again, you can find the dimensions below. I've sized it to accommodate an A10 crucible, although at present I'm using A6 crucibles. The lid is of similar construction, again mild steel sheet, and in use it rests on top of the furnace body. The body and lid have been lined with 2 layers of 25mm high temperature ceramic fibre, which was bonded in place with sodium silicate and then rigidised with a thin spray of colloidal silica. All of the hot surfaces were then given a thin coating of ITC 100. It's a high performance ceramic coating that significantly increases the thermal efficiency of a furnace. Now, strictly speaking, you could probably get away without using the rigidizer, because the ITC 100 also seals and rigidises the wool. But it's a whole lot easier to paint this stuff onto a rigid surface than it is to paint it onto a soft wool surface, so I'd still say use both. After firing, it forms a hard, heat-reflective shell over the top of the ceramic fibre. And whilst it does work well, there's a drawback to be aware of that I'll go through later. And the last little feature to point out are the simple tab handles that I've welded onto the sides. They're very easy to hold onto, especially while wearing thick gloves. Okay, so now a few of the pros and cons that I've discovered so far. A big positive to mention first up is that it's very easy to set up and break down. All of the components are light and easy to move around, and I also like that it's modular. Every furnace has a finite life and will wear out eventually, so it's good to know that I can simply swap out sections of it once they become a liability without having to junk the whole thing. Now, the fact that it's very light means that it can be lifted up and stored on a bench or shelf instead of taking up valuable floor space. Which leads to the other big plus, and the main reason that I went this way with the design. Having a low physical mass also means that it has a low thermal mass, so it heats up very quickly. Compared to a furnace made entirely from castable refractory, a much smaller proportion of the energy is being stored in the body of the furnace itself. Now, this rather suits the way that I intend to use it, which is basically for ad hoc one-off castings. I'll rarely need to do multiple melts in a single day, so I wouldn't really get the benefit of a heavy solid cast furnace that holds its heat between melts. Now, on the con side, the first thing to mention is that this is definitely not a cheap furnace to make. In my part of the world, it's impossible to buy the required materials in small quantities. So I've ended up with lifetime supplies of a lot of this stuff, even though I only needed a fraction of what I had to order. But just based on what I actually used for construction, I'd estimate material costs to be around $300 US, which, considering I've ended up with quite an efficient furnace, I'm pretty happy with. Now, another drawback is the brittle nature of the ceramic coating. I have to be much more careful with this furnace than if it were all solid refractory, and in fact I accidentally chipped it while shooting this video. For the other benefits it brings though, it's a drawback I'm happy to live with. It's easy enough to patch it up with some spare coating and push it straight back into service. The repair fuses with the surrounding ceramic and it's basically undetectable. And the final con to mention is that the low thermal mass means that it cools down very quickly. There's no thermal bank sitting around the crucible like there would be with a full castable refractory furnace. But so far I haven't found this to be an issue at all. It just means that there can be no delay in pouring, which is pretty much the case for any home furnace where pouring occurs directly from the crucible. Now, one thing I've noticed is that the higher temperature melts like copper are a little more destructive on the hot face than, say, for example, aluminium. So I'm holding off on pushing to find the top temperature of the furnace just yet until I've done the next few videos. I don't want to risk wrecking it. Currently, it's bringing a full A6 crucible of copper up to pouring temperature without issue. So I think it's probably fair to say there's a bit more headroom to go, and I'll find out where that limit is over the coming months. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.